The Daily Derech. We are walking the path of holiness.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. Welcome to the Daily Derech, a special project of exploring Judaism, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the Rabbinical Assembly, and Temple of Aaron. Today is the first day after Shabbat Kodesh, the 13th of Tammuz, 5786, corresponding in the secular calendar to Sunday, June 28th, 2026. We will read Parashat Pinchas this coming Shabbat. Let's begin. Me'am Loez. Let's begin the new Parsha of Pinchas. God spoke to Moses, saying, Pinchas, a son of Eleazar and grandson of Aaron the priest, was the one who zealously took up my cause among the Israelites and turned my anger away from them, so that I did not destroy them in my demand for zealousness or exclusivity. We kind of walk into the middle of a story in Parashat Pinchas. It's really interesting that this is sort of the way the rabbis decided to divide the parshiot here, because we really walk into the middle of a story. You see, right before we read this parsha, we actually see that there's this horrible problem going on in Bnei Israel, which is that the Bnei Israel begin to start having relationships with the Midianite women, who, according to our rabbis, were not just trying to engage them out of love or some kind of sexual relationship, but instead were, through a sexual relationship of some sort, were causing them to worship a foreign god. And this was sort of the plan. Originally came from Bilam in the previous parsha, although we didn't get to it in the Daily Derech this year because of the nature of the triennial cycle. And so what happens, and we see, is that Moses tries to stop this from happening. The people refuse, and there's one particular chieftain, Zimri, who is so, let's just say, confident in his behavior, that decides to do something incredible and horrible. He decides to have sex with a Midianite woman, Cozbi, in front of the Ohel Moed, in front of Moshe Rabbeinu. And this really shows the rebelliousness at this time of completely disregarding Moshe's authority, completely disregarding God's laws and what God requires of us in this covenantal relationship, which is exclusive worship. And the issue, the biggest issue, of course, in this whole entire thing was not the fact that according to the rabbis at least, was not that the Jewish people were necessarily just having sexual relationships with Midianite women, but really that they were being used in this way to then engage in idolatry of a foreign god. And what we see is that there's a man named Pinchas who comes up and stands up when Moses seems like he's going to give up, and it looks like sort of all authority has been lost, all respect for God has been lost, that this chieftain, this leader of Israel, is willing to do this incredible thing of doing this act in front of the whole entire community, in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, with no embarrassment whatsoever. That Pinchas gets up and spears both Zimri and Cozbi, kills them both, and by doing so, actually causes the anger of God to withdraw. Now, right before this happened, already the Jewish people began to be punished, and 24,000 Israelites had died in a plague because of violating this exclusive relationship with Hashem that they promised. And when Pinchas did this act, this very, very zealous act, what we see is that it stemmed God's anger and frustration and caused the plague to end. The Me'am Loez tries to understand what this really means here and sort of what is going on. What is behind Pinchas' action? How did it stop God's anger? Well, the Me'am Loez basically says that the Israelites, God's anger, one might think that the God's anger was cooled and satisfied because of the fact of that the Israelites, enough of them were killed. 24,000 victims were killed, and maybe that's just enough. And maybe it wasn't really Pinchas' zealous action that actually caused the anger of God to dissipate. That maybe just a certain amount of Jews needed to just pay the price. A horrible way to think. But that's not the regard. It's actually that Pinchas caused this one person, through their zealous action, their courageous action, actually caused God's plague to stop, and God caused God's anger to go away. It's explained in the Me'am Loez through a certain parable. We may think of this in the following way. A certain monarch, while traveling, happened to come across a group of men, one of whom abused and insulted him. Greatly angered, the king was about to kill them, when a member of this group rose to the occasion and slew the man who had insulted him. Seeing that there was at least one among them who was disturbed enough to avenge the insult suffered by him, his anger ebbed away. So what we see here is that we see that the plague actually could have been a lot worse. It really could have been a lot worse. This might have been the end for the Jewish people. God might have finally given up on the Jewish people at this moment. Moshe almost certainly did. He just seemed to give up almost and just say, this is too much. But because Pinchas expressed care and said, no, this relationship really matters, and I'm willing to put myself in a dangerous situation, I'm willing to step up and be zealous on behalf of you, God, that at least someone in this whole people, that this relationship really matters. And that's what God, I think what this parsha at least begins to teach us, is that's what this parsha teaches us, is that even if almost everybody else is doing something wrong and oppressing somebody or hurting somebody else, especially hurting God and not caring about what God wants or requires from us in our covenantal relationship, and one Jew steps up and sacrifices extensively in order to serve Hashem,
Mishnah Torah.
do actually matter.
We're going to go on in the laws of the recitation of
That
the Shema.
makes a profound
Today we're
effect
going to learn
on Hashem.
halacha.
Makes a profound
second chapter,
profound
halacha
effect.
8.
They live in the legacy
Not halacha 8,
of Pinchas,
halacha 9.
to assuage the anger.
So this really has to do with the pronunciation
Hashem.
of the Shema, something that is
For the breakdown
at
in the
some point
covenantal
actually difficult to
relationship.
achieve.
I think this
for,
shows the power of one
English
Jew
speakers
who's committed
non-Hebrew speakers
to exclusively serving
but it's
Hashem
something we
in
have to
their
be
life
careful about.
and willing to sacrifice.
We've been
for
told
it
over and over
can cause
again
a
about the seriousness of
huge
saying the Shema.
impact.
That
Hopefully
is
that should
required.
be inspiration for us, and maybe that's
really
why
this often comes
the
up
rabbis
making
began
sure
the
that each
parsha
word is
after the
pronounced correctly,
plague,
that we're actually
after
saying
all these,
if the mitzvah is to say
Zimri,
these
the whole
words,
Midianite
and
incident,
the Torah
but
mitzvah,
instead
we
began
really have
with
to
what
make sure
Pinchas did
that
and how
we're
Pinchas
pronouncing
was
it
able
correctly.
to assuage
And this
the
is something
anger
that I think many
Hashem
people make a
at that
mistake
moment.
in, and something that is kind of a new path to discovery, hopefully, for many Jews who are inclined this way, but important to learn for anyone who wants to take this seriously. So the Rambam goes like this: Ketzad yidakdek? How must one enunciate the words in the Shema? He must be careful not to pronounce a letter with a strong dagesh as if there was no dagesh. So what is the dagesh? It's that little dot that you put in a letter, like a bet, right? When you put when there is no dot or no dagesh in the bet, it becomes a vet. And once you put a dot in a vet, it becomes a bet. And so it actually changes the pronunciation of the letter itself. And so we have to make sure that we pronounce it with the correct dagesh, and we don't sub between one. The example, the commentary in the English language translation brings here, which is illustrative, is e.g. we're one to say vidivarta in vam instead of the proper pronunciation, which would be vidibarta bam, right? Get it? Vidibarta bam is correct. Vidivarta bam is incorrect. Or the opposite, of course, a letter with no dagesh as if there was one. So, right, same principle, but the opposite. Now, this one is a little bit more difficult, especially if one does not is not classically trained in Hebrew. Nor should one pronounce the silent shva, e.g., to say b'chol levavecha instead of b'chol levavcha. So there are two kinds of silent vowels in Hebrew. most people who study Hebrew know there is a silent vowel that's one dot on top of the other. It's called a shva. But it technically could be considered a silent shva or a pronounced shva. So many Hebrew teachers in America teach people, okay, when you see this vowel, sometimes you have to actually pronounce the consonant separately, and sometimes you don't. This is understood by the two different kinds of shvas, and in many modern Sidurim, they actually bold the shvas that need to actually be pronounced and leave regular the shvas that just are silent. So the examples they give, and again, these we actually make a mistake all the time, I think. The first example that's given is nor should one pronounce. The first example is that one should not pronounce a silent shva. So the example given in the English, which I think is important. So bechol levavecha instead of bechol levavcha, right? I'm sorry. Nor should one pronounce the silent shva, right? So bechol levavecha would be wrong, and bechol levavcha would be correct. You see that levav, so it's whether you're saying, if you're changing that second vet into a separate syllable in itself, bechol levavecha, versus combining it with the previous syllable, bechol levavcha, or the opposite. This happens in bechol nafshecha. So if you say bechol nafshecha, that would be wrong, right? That's making a pronounced shva into a silent shva. And instead, you should say bechol nafshecha. Understand the difference? Very important. Okay. There are more ideas here of what we need to do that are, I think, maybe a little bit easier for us as non-native Hebrew speakers. He says, therefore, one must pause between two words in which the first word ends with the same letter with which the second word begins. So what does this mean here? It's when one word, the first word of a sentence, of a phrase, ends with the same letter that begins the next word. So the example here, we use this phrase a lot, bechol levavcha, right? Bechol levavcha, right? So you see there's a lamed at the end of bechol and a lamed at the beginning of levavecha. So what might happen is, if you're saying the Kriyat Shema relatively fast and not paying attention, you might say becholvcha, right? Becholvcha, and you actually might miss a lamed. So you really actually need to pause between bechol and levavcha, right? So bechol levavcha, bechol, not bechol levavcha, bechol levavcha. In many traditional Sidurim, I don't think this is in the Sidur Sim Shalom, but in many traditional Sidurim, they actually have these horizontal lines between two words that end and begin with the same letter, just to remind you to have that space there. And it's worth trying to find a Sidur that has that when you're looking for a Sidur to purchase, if you're looking beyond the beautiful Sidur Sim Shalom. I'm not sure if this is in the new Lev Shalom or not. I'm not sure if they put this in or not in the new Sidur. Also, famously, one needs to pronounce distinctly the Tiz Karu part of the third paragraph. Tiz Karu. Very important to say that. Because if you don't say that, it could sound like other words, like Tiz Karu, right? Or something else. So tiskaru actually means to garner reward or to gain money from something, schar. So if you say tiskaru, instead of, it might say the only reason, remember to do the mitzvah because you're going to get rewarded for doing it, instead of, then the remember part wouldn't even be tiskaru vasita mitzvah, right? So make money and do them. That's what you would be saying, instead of remember and do them, right? So it's very important you to pronounce tiz karu. You don't have to be annoying about it. You don't have to go zzz, which is a frustrating thing that happens in Minyan sometimes. But you could just say tiz karu, right? And so that you can actually make sure you pronounce it correctly. The last one is Echad, and the idea that the Dalet at the end of Echad in Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad should be pronounced correctly, and that is because if you don't pronounce it correctly, if you don't pronounce it strongly, it might sound like Acher or Echar, right? Which would mean, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is other, or there's another God, right? Which is the exact opposite of what you're trying to say, which is there's one God. So again, pronounce the Dalet correctly, but I think the same idea should be here. That let's not say it's so annoying that you hear "duh" resounding out throughout the Beit Midrash, and then it becomes interruptive of people's prayers. That almost makes it a cartoon. Just make sure to say "duh," right? Very importantly. So I hope you take these things home for when you recite the Shema on yourself, and try them at home. See if you can do it. Menorat HaMaor. We'll continue learning the introduction of the first chapter of this book, and we'll continue, the introduction to the first candle of this book, first part. And we are going to continue learning this story that we started on Erev Shabbos, on last Friday, about Moses asking God for things and sort of God giving him answers about some tough questions that exist. So the story continues here of Moses saying to God, according to the rabbis, Master of the universe, why is it that there is a righteous person for whom things go well while another righteous person suffers? Why is there a wicked person for whom things go well while other wicked persons suffer? Right? It doesn't seem like judgment is necessarily happening. You can actually mistake what is happening in the world and say maybe God doesn't judge. Right? I think that's what's behind Moses' question. And I don't think it's to see that Moses is questioning whether God judges or not, but he's saying, why does it appear sometimes like it does? And we've been talking about this question a lot, but it's interesting to see the way that God answers this question. God answered him, Moses, a righteous person for whom things go well is the son of a righteous person. A righteous person who suffers is the son of a wicked person. A wicked person for whom things go well is the son of a righteous person, and a wicked person who suffers is the son of a wicked person. So what he's saying is that we actually have the merit of those who come before us and also the curses of those who come before us. You know, even if you are very righteous and your ancestors before you have been very wicked, you might not, you might have a lot of trouble because of that, because of the bad things that your ancestors have done in the past. On the other hand, if you're very wicked, yet you've had a tremendous amount of righteous ancestors before you, you might not experience suffering in the same way because of the merit of the ancestors who came before you. This is a really important principle in Judaism called Zchut Avotenu v'Imenu, the merit of our forefathers and mothers. And it's an interesting principle. Again, it very much, I think, goes against this instinct in America, especially for American Jews, of this idea of, you know, every Jew is sort of seen in their own light as their own kind of siloed off separate individual. I've explained over and over again that, you know, many concepts in Judaism, in many places within the Torah, that is a relatively alien principle. And we are not just ourselves, we are also based on those who come before us. And this actually makes a lot of sense in some ways. If you think about it, like the idea is that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. We stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. We're not just ourselves, but we're our whole family line. We're all those, you know, we are not ourselves. We are also a revelation of our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents and all going all the way back. So we're living not as some silo tabula rasa, as it was once called, or sort of empty slate, but we actually exist based off of previous generations. This is what connects us to previous generations, and actually makes our lives, I think, much bigger and, of course, much more complicated. It's that for that reason why you often sometimes see that judgment doesn't go correctly. And I think this point actually takes a lot more processing and understanding, and obviously I think can be interpreted and seen in a bad light. And I totally understand that, right? You know, I totally get that this doesn't compute or this doesn't seem to work every time, but I do think it's a very deep answer. So this comes from, there's also another sort of answer that I don't know. I don't think this is exactly necessarily what God says here, but this might be an interpolation from the Menorat HaMaor here. But regardless, there are also wicked people whose lives are prolonged for a time, but at the end of the days they are punished for their wickedness. They fall and never rise again, as it is written, for through the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again, but the wicked stumble in calamity. So this is a very famous passage from Proverbs 24:16. So it says, the righteous fall 7 times, and each time they rise again, but the wicked only fall once, and they fall completely. Now, I think when looking at the world, again, this is another principle where you can say, well, it seems like a lot of times the wicked fail completely, and then they rise up again, and there's sometimes where a righteous person fails completely and never rises up again. That's, again, only considering Olam Hazeh, only considering this world. But if you actually consider the legacy of a human being, and not just their time in this world while they're alive, then the principle actually makes more sense. And then, of course, when you bring in Olam Haba and the world to come and what happens in the future, certainly I think this principle makes more sense. The idea being that even if a righteous person falls over and over again, and even dies in a fallen state, the legacy of sort of remembering them should be painted if they really are a righteous person, which means, at least in the idea of the Rambam, that the majority of their deeds are for righteousness, that they should be remembered for good and remembered for a great example. And legacy is important for who we are. And also, of course, in Olam Haba, in the world of eternality after we pass away, this would be considered something that, obviously then the righteous will be rewarded for the good deeds they do in the future. But the wicked person, even if they do a couple of righteous deeds and they're able to get up a few times in this world, eventually, because they'll be remembered as a wicked person, their legacy will be very poor and not be a good example, and eventually be forgotten. And certainly in the world to come, they'll be punished for the wrongdoing that they do. So again, they fall completely, and that falling lasts forever, right? So very, very important here. Or at least depending on how you see the Jewish life, at least like a year, right? But regardless, remembered as a wicked person. In the end, a person can't escape divine justice. Very, very important. It's just part of the system, and we must accept it. That's an essential part of Judaism.
Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Derech. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me anytime at rmr@templeofaaron.org. Thank you so much for listening. There are so many people to thank, and you can look in the show notes for that. And also, if you want to know and see any of these texts in the original, we actually have that too. You can actually find that in our episode description. So look in each of the episode descriptions and you'll find that information right there. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.